The Texas Hill Country in 1898 was a land of extremes. Brutal summers that could crack the earth, winters that tested a man's resolve, and opportunities that seemed limitless for those with the courage to seize them. But opportunity meant nothing without the right circumstances, the right partnerships, and sometimes the right gamble. This is a story about a gamble that changed everything, a $3 transaction that would become the foundation of a legacy that transcended anything either party could have imagined when their paths first crossed. It's a story about a man who believed he could buy what he needed, and a woman who proved that some things cannot be purchased, only earned through trust, determination, and the willingness to refuse the limitations others tried to impose on her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Stone Ridge Ranch, sprawled across 125,000 acres of prime Texas terrain, a kingdom built by a man named Silas Thorne over the course of 3 decades. At 54 years old, Silas had accumulated everything society deemed valuable: land holdings that extended beyond the horizon, cattle herds numbering in the tens of thousands, business interests in 3 major Texas cities, and a reputation that preceded him into every room he entered. Men deferred to his judgment. Banks competed for his investment. Territorial governors sought his counsel on matters of development and commerce. Yet Silas lacked the one thing his considerable wealth could not reliably purchase: an heir, a son to carry forward the Stone Ridge name and the empire he'd built through decades of calculated decisions and relentless work. His first marriage, contracted when he was a young man with more ambition than experience, had produced no children despite years of effort. His second wife, a woman from a prominent San Antonio family, had been selected specifically for her youth and presumed fertility. That union had lasted 8 years and 2 miscarriages before his wife had finally admitted that she could not give him what he'd married her to provide. The separation had been cordial but decisive. Silas was not a man who accepted failure gracefully, and he certainly wasn't a man who spent years dwelling on past mistakes. Instead, he'd done what he always did when confronted with a problem. He sought a solution with pragmatic clarity. It was during a business trip to Austin that Silas encountered his foreman, a man named Thomas Garrett, who'd worked for him for nearly 15 years and understood his employer's methods with unusual intimacy. They were dining at a restaurant overlooking the Colorado River when Thomas broached a subject that was clearly uncomfortable for him, yet important enough to warrant the conversation. "There are markets for certain arrangements, Mr. Thorne," Thomas had said, carefully, his hat resting on the table beside his plate. "Unofficial markets, but they exist. Women without prospects, men seeking practical solutions to domestic needs. There are gatherings, let's call them, where these arrangements are negotiated." Silas had looked up from his beefsteak, his expression neutral. "You're suggesting a marriage auction?" "I'm suggesting that such things occur," Thomas had replied. "Whether you'd consider participating is entirely your decision, sir. But I thought it worth mentioning, given what you've expressed about needing to resolve the heir situation." "And you've heard this from reliable sources?" Silas had asked. "I have," Thomas confirmed. "A cousin of my wife's participated in one 3 years ago. She's been married since, has 2 children, and from what we understand, she's reasonably content with her situation." The conversation had lingered in Silas's mind for weeks. It was unusual, certainly. It was morally questionable in ways he couldn't entirely dismiss. But it was also practical, which was the lens through which Silas evaluated most significant decisions. If such arrangements existed, and if they could solve a legitimate problem, then refusing to consider them seemed foolish rather than principled. 2 months later, Silas found himself in a carriage, traveling toward a town in central Texas called Riverside, a community of perhaps 3,000 people, unremarkable in most ways, except for the fact that it apparently hosted one of the largest marriage arrangements in the territory. Thomas accompanied him, along with another trusted employee, a man named David Chen, who managed the financial aspects of the Stone Ridge operations. "Are you certain about this, sir?" David had asked during the journey. "This seems quite irregular. Most valuable opportunities seem irregular until they prove themselves otherwise." Silas had replied, watching the landscape shift from open prairie to increasingly wooded terrain. "I'm not committing to anything. I'm observing. I'm gathering information. The decision comes after I understand what's actually available." The venue was a converted warehouse on the outskirts of Riverside, a structure that had previously housed agricultural equipment and grain supplies. Tonight it served as an unlikely marketplace for human futures. Approximately 30 men had gathered, ranging in age from early 20s to men in their 60s. The financial circumstances of the attendees were clearly mixed. Some appeared to be wealthy landowners, others were clearly farmers or ranch hands seeking practical help with household management. Perhaps 40 women stood in a semi-organized line along one wall of the warehouse, though organized was perhaps too generous a term. They ranged in age from barely 18 to women approaching 50. Their clothing suggested varying levels of desperation. Some had attempted to present themselves respectfully, wearing their finest dresses, despite visible signs of wear. Others made no pretense of preparing for the occasion, their garments patched and faded, suggesting that presentation had seemed irrelevant to their circumstances. The auctioneer was a thin man with receding hair and an expression that suggested he found the entire enterprise distasteful, though he seemed practiced at conducting the proceedings with mechanical efficiency. He began with a woman in her early 20s, describing her as healthy, competent in household management, available for marriage to a man of reasonable means. The opening bid was $15. She sold for $22 to a farmer who seemed moderately satisfied with his acquisition. The pattern continued throughout the evening. Women were presented with brief descriptions, emphasizing their practical value, cooking abilities, sewing skills, physical health, reproductive history where relevant. The bidding was generally modest, with most sales concluding between $10 and $35. Silas observed with the detached interest of a man analyzing a business transaction in which he'd not yet decided to invest personally. It was the final candidate who captured his attention, not immediately, but with increasing intensity as the auctioneer provided the details. "This is Miss Sarah Winters, age 26, originally from Georgia, recently relocated to Texas seeking employment. She possesses exceptional skills in animal husbandry, horse training, and ranch management. She's in excellent physical health." However, the auctioneer paused, clearly uncomfortable with what he'd been instructed to say next. "She has been examined by 2 physicians who concur that she's unlikely to conceive. She's barren, and this fact has been disclosed to all potential bidders as required." The woman who stepped forward was not what Silas had expected. She was tall, perhaps 5'10", with the kind of physical strength that suggested genuine experience with ranch work. Her hair was light brown, pulled back in a practical arrangement. Her face was not conventionally pretty, but striking in a way that suggested intelligence and capability. What struck Silas most was her posture. She stood with her shoulders back, her chin level, regarding the assembled men with an expression that suggested she was assessing them rather than being assessed. "Do I hear an opening bid?" the auctioneer asked, clearly uncertain whether anyone would bid at all for a woman explicitly described as barren. The opening bid came from a man in the 3rd row. $5. It was an insulting bid, barely more than a nominal amount, and Sarah's expression flickered with something that might have been contempt before returning to its neutral assessment. "Do I hear more?" the auctioneer asked. Silas found himself raising his hand. $3, he said quietly. The room fell silent. The auctioneer blinked, clearly confused. "I'm sorry, sir, did you bid lower than the previous bid?" "I did," Silas confirmed. "The woman is listed as barren, which eliminates her primary value in this market. Her other skills, ranch management, animal husbandry, horse training are valuable, but not at a premium rate. $3 reflects her actual utility, divorced from reproductive capacity. It was a calculated insult delivered with perfect logic, and everyone in the room recognized it as such. But it was also analytically sound. The farmer who'd bid $5 looked between Silas and Sarah, clearly torn between defending his bid and recognizing its illogic. Finally, he lowered his hand. "Going once," the auctioneer said, his voice uncertain. "Going twice. Sold to the gentleman for $3. Sarah descended from the platform where she'd been standing and made her way towards Silas with movements that suggested she was processing what had just occurred. Up close, her eyes were revealed as blue-gray, sharp and intelligent, with the kind of directness that suggested she didn't waste time with social pretense. "Mister?" she prompted, extending her hand. "Silas Thorne," he replied, taking her hand. Her grip was firm, her palm calloused from genuine work. "And you are?" he asked, though he already knew the answer. "Sarah Winters," she replied. "And I suspect you just purchased me based on a significant miscalculation, Mr. Thorne. This was unexpected." Silas had anticipated gratitude, perhaps some careful negotiation about terms of employment. Instead, Sarah was suggesting that his analysis had been flawed. "How so?" he asked, genuinely curious. "The physicians who declared me Barren examined me in Boston 4 years ago," Sarah explained, her voice steady and measured. "That was during a period when I was living in poverty, working 14-hour days as a seamstress, and had recently lost my only child to scarlet fever. Grief and malnutrition can affect fertility in ways that seem permanent, but often aren't. I've spent the intervening years rebuilding my health, securing stable employment, establishing better living circumstances. I've never had another examination to confirm whether the original verdict remains accurate." She paused, allowing this information to settle. "I'm not claiming I can definitely conceive. I'm claiming that the information you based your bid on may be incomplete. If you wanted a woman purely for her ranch management skills, you've made an excellent investment at $3. If you wanted the possibility of children, you may have gotten luckier than you realized." Silas studied her for a long moment. He'd intended to acquire a compliant woman, someone so grateful for escape from her circumstances that she would cooperate without question. Instead, he appeared to have acquired someone considerably more complex and honest about her own uncertainty. "What exactly do you want, Miss Winters?" he asked. "Right now?" "Stability," Sarah replied without hesitation. "A position with wages, a place to sleep that's secure, food that's reliable. If that comes with the possibility of marriage, I'm not opposed to it, provided the terms are clear and respectful. Beyond that, I'm uncertain about my own future capacity to bear children, which is precisely why I disclosed it." Deception seemed like a worse option than honesty. Silas made a decision in that moment. Rather than dismissing Sarah and seeking a different arrangement, he decided to take a genuine risk on the incomplete information she'd provided. "I own a substantial ranch in the hill country," he said. "I need a wife, primarily for household management and potentially for bearing children, though I'm willing to negotiate on that second point if the first is manageable. I'm also willing to pay fair wages for your expertise with horses and ranch operations. Would such an arrangement interest you?" Sarah considered this carefully. "How many children are you seeking?" she asked. "As many as biologically possible," Silas replied. "I'm 54. I want heirs before I'm too old to see them develop into adulthood." "Then I can't guarantee I'll fulfill that requirement," Sarah said. "But I can guarantee that if conception is possible for me, your ranch and security would be the circumstances most likely to enable it. That's the honest answer I can offer." "It's more honest than I expected," Silas acknowledged. "When could you be ready to marry?" "As soon as the paperwork can be arranged," Sarah replied. "I have no possessions beyond what I'm wearing, and no obligations keeping me here." They were married 3 days later, with Thomas Garrett and David Chen as witnesses. In a brief ceremony conducted by a justice of the peace, Silas had arranged for a physician in Austin to examine Sarah, and the examination had revealed what Silas suspected: her reproductive system appeared fundamentally normal, though whether she could conceive after 4 years without pregnancy was genuinely uncertain. Dr. Elliot, the examining physician, had been cautiously optimistic. "There's nothing physiologically preventing conception," the doctor had explained. "The barrenness diagnosis appears to have been based on incomplete examination and perhaps some assumptions about the effects of grief and malnutrition that weren't entirely justified. Whether she can actually conceive is a matter for biology to determine, not for medicine to predict with certainty." As Silas and his new wife made the journey from Austin back to the Stone Ridge Ranch, he found himself wondering what exactly he'd acquired for his $3. A woman with questionable fertility, certainly, but also a woman who'd been honest about her uncertainty, who possessed genuine skills and competence, and who seemed to understand the practical nature of their arrangement without needing it spelled out extensively. It was an unusual beginning to what would become an even more unusual partnership. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Stone Ridge Ranch announced itself long before the carriage actually reached it. The approach was marked by carefully maintained grazing pastures where cattle moved with the organized efficiency of a well-managed operation. The fencing was pristine, the gates hung on substantial hinges that suggested both craftsmanship and expense. Even the prairie itself seemed more ordered here, as though Silas Thorne's influence extended to the landscape itself, imposing structure and purpose on the natural world. When the main house came into view, Sarah's breath caught slightly, though she managed to keep her expression neutral. The structure was impressive, a substantial 2-story mansion built of limestone that had been hauled from a quarry 40 miles distant. The architecture was informed by traditional Texas ranch design, but elevated with details that suggested the builder had invested considerably in both quality and aesthetics. A wraparound porch with substantial columns fronted the main entrance, and the overall composition suggested a man who'd built not just a working ranch, but a statement about his position and power. "This is the Stone Ridge Ranch," Silas said as the carriage came to a halt before the main entrance. "This has been my life's work for the past 30 years. Now I suppose it's partially yours." Sarah stepped out of the carriage and took in the full scope of the property. Beyond the main house were numerous outbuildings, barns, corrals, storage structures, and what appeared to be quarters for ranch hands. The organization was evident in every detail. This was not a haphazard operation, but a carefully orchestrated enterprise where every element had a defined purpose and place. A woman emerged from the house as they approached, perhaps in her late 50s, with grey-streaked hair pulled back severely and an expression that suggested she'd been managing households since before Sarah was born. This was Eleanor Hutchins, Silas's housekeeper for the past 12 years, and as Sarah would quickly discover, the actual authority that maintained daily operations at Stone Ridge. "Mr. Thorne," Eleanor said, her tone suggesting she'd already heard the unlikely story of his marriage and had formed definitive opinions about it. "Welcome home. And Mrs. Thorne." The way she said Mrs. Thorne suggested Eleanor was reserving judgment about whether Sarah deserved the title. "Eleanor, this is Sarah," Silas said, introducing them with characteristic directness. "She'll be managing the household with your guidance. She also has considerable experience with horses and ranch operations, which we may find valuable in other capacities. I'd appreciate it if you'd show her to the master bedroom and ensure she has whatever she needs to settle in." Eleanor's expression shifted slightly, as though she were recalculating her initial assessment. "The master bedroom? I had assumed Mrs. Thorne would be in the East Wing, guest suite." "The master bedroom," Silas confirmed. "We're married, Eleanor. The sleeping arrangements should reflect that." It was a statement that established several things simultaneously. First, that despite the unusual circumstances of their meeting, Silas intended to treat this as a genuine marriage rather than a hired position. Second, that he was willing to disregard social convention about how such unusual marriages were typically arranged. And third, that Eleanor's opinions, however strongly held, would not dictate the terms of his household. Eleanor recovered quickly, her professionalism reasserting itself. "Of course, Mr. Thorne." "Come, Mrs. Thorne, I'll show you upstairs." The master bedroom was as impressive as the rest of the house, large, well-appointed, with substantial windows that overlooked the ranch property. The furnishings were expensive but impersonal, suggesting that the room reflected Silas's tastes rather than any woman's input. There was a dressing room, connected to the bedroom, and beyond that a bathing chamber that was luxurious by frontier standards. "The Colonel, Mr. Thorne, prefers dinner at 7, Eleanor explained as she showed Sarah the space. "His schedule is quite regular. He's typically in his study by 8 in the morning, reviewing correspondence and financial matters. He conducts ranch operations from his desk as much as from horseback. The household staff numbers 12, myself, the cook, 3 cleaning women, 2 laundresses, a gardener, 3 stable hands, and a general maintenance man. You'll be expected to oversee them, though they report directly to me regarding daily operations." "What was my predecessor's arrangement?" Sarah asked, observing Eleanor's careful explanation of the hierarchy. Eleanor paused slightly. "There was no predecessor, Mrs. Thorne. Mr. Thorne has been managing the household himself for the past 8 years, since his previous marriage ended. He relied heavily on my management, but the authority ultimately rested with him rather than with a wife." This was significant information. Sarah understood immediately that Eleanor had held considerable authority in Silas's absence of a wife, and the arrival of a woman in that position represented a potential diminishment of Eleanor's control. The housekeeper's civility was professional, but it was also cautious. Eleanor was evaluating whether Sarah was a legitimate threat to her position or a woman who could be managed. "I have no interest in displacing you, Eleanor," Sarah said directly. "I have experience with household management, but I also know that you understand the specific operations and preferences of this household in ways I don't. I'd prefer to work collaboratively with you rather than around you." Eleanor's expression shifted, becoming slightly warmer. "That would be preferable. Mrs. Thorne, shall I have your clothing sent up? I assume you'll need to acquire a wardrobe suitable to your position. Mr. Thorne has accounts with merchants in Austin. You can arrange whatever you need." After Eleanor departed, Sarah sat on the edge of the vast bed and allowed herself to feel the weight of what had occurred. 48 hours ago, she'd been standing on a platform in a warehouse, being sold for $3 to a man she'd never met. Now, she was the wife of one of the most prominent ranchers in Texas, with authority over a household of 12 people, living in accommodations that would have seemed impossibly luxurious a week ago. The uncertainty about her fertility hung over all of it, though. Silas had purchased her ostensibly to bear children, and the physicians in Austin had provided only cautious possibility rather than assurance. What would happen if she couldn't conceive? How long would Silas tolerate a marriage that failed to fulfill its primary purpose? Dinner that evening was a formal affair, conducted in a dining room large enough to seat 20 people. Only 2 place settings had been arranged, positioned at one end of the long table. Silas was already seated when Sarah entered, having changed into a simple but elegant dress that Eleanor had selected from the wardrobe already provided. "You look appropriate," Silas observed, which Sarah interpreted as his version of a compliment. "How are you settling in?" "The house is extraordinary," Sarah replied, accepting the seat that had been arranged for her. "Eleanor is competent and clearly well established in her role. I don't foresee significant conflict if I approach this collaboratively." "Good," Silas said. "Eleanor has been essential to maintaining operations. I want her to remain satisfied with her position. You should understand that I value competence above all other considerations. If you prove yourself capable, I'll expand your authority. If you prove yourself incapable, I'll restrict it. The path forward depends on your actual performance, not on your position as my wife." It was a pragmatic assessment, delivered without sentiment, and Sarah found herself oddly reassured by it. There would be no false courtesy, no pretense of affection where none existed. Instead, there would be a clear framework within which she could operate, succeed, and establish her value beyond the capacity to bear children. "I understand," Sarah said. "I'd like to understand the ranch operations more fully. If I'm to be wife to the owner of Stoneridge, I should know what Stoneridge actually is." Silas's expression shifted slightly, as though he'd expected her to focus on household management rather than express interest in the broader business. "I'll arrange for David Chen to show you the operations. He manages the financial side of the business, but he understands the entire operation in detail. You'll find him knowledgeable and patient with questions." Over the following weeks, Sarah began a systematic education in the workings of the Stoneridge Ranch. David Chen proved to be exactly as Silas had described: knowledgeable, patient, and capable of explaining complex operations in ways that someone without extensive ranching background could understand. The ranch was not merely a cattle operation, though that was the core business. Silas had diversified into horse breeding, particularly Arabian and quarter-horse bloodlines that were increasingly in demand across Texas and beyond. There was also a significant investment in land development, with Silas having purchased several smaller ranches over the years and consolidated them into the larger Stoneridge operation. The financial structures were sophisticated, involving banking relationships in Austin, San Antonio, and even Dallas. Silas had constructed something approaching a business empire, using the ranch as the foundation, but extending far beyond it. During one of these educational sessions, David mentioned casually that Silas had been consulting with architects about expanding the house. "The West Wing has been designed, but not yet constructed," David explained. "Mr. Thorne wants to have it ready before." He paused, clearly uncertain how to phrase what he was about to say. "Before I become pregnant," Sarah finished for him. "Before children arrive and the current space becomes insufficient." "Yes," David confirmed. "The original design for the West Wing was commissioned about 4 years ago, when Mr. Thorne was married to his previous wife. He's updated the plans since then, but the intention remains the same, to have adequate space for children should they arrive." Sarah understood the implications clearly. Silas had been preparing for the possibility of heirs, even while his previous marriage was failing. The $3 purchase of Sarah was not a desperate gamble, but rather the latest iteration of a long-term plan to secure the succession he desired. It was during her 3rd week at the ranch that Sarah made her way to the horse corrals to observe the breeding stock. She'd mentioned her interest to Eleanor, who'd provided clear directions to the facilities. What she found was a collection of animals that demonstrated genuine quality and careful selection. The bloodlines represented years of deliberate breeding decisions, with each animal serving a specific purpose in the overall program. A young man named James, one of the stable hands, was working with a mare when Sarah arrived. He recognized her immediately as the new Mrs. Thorne and set down his tools respectfully. "Mrs. Thorne, can I help you with something?" he asked. "I'd like to understand the breeding program," Sarah replied. "The selection criteria, the intended outcomes, the timeline for producing marketable animals. Can you walk me through it?" James hesitated, clearly uncertain whether a woman, and particularly the new wife, had legitimate authority to ask for such information. But Sarah's directness and genuine interest were evident, and James was young enough and practical enough to respond to competence when he encountered it. Over the next several hours, James explained the breeding program in detail. Sarah asked intelligent questions, made observations about potential improvements, and demonstrated that her interest was neither superficial nor frivolous. By the time she returned to the house, she'd identified several inefficiencies in the current approach and had formulated suggestions for optimizing the program. That evening, she presented these observations to Silas over dinner, fully expecting him to dismiss them as interference from someone who lacked sufficient expertise. Instead, he listened carefully, asked clarifying questions, and by the end of the conversation had agreed to implement several of her suggestions on a trial basis. "You understand animals," he observed when she'd finished explaining her thinking. "This isn't theoretical knowledge. You've actually worked with horses." "I grew up on a farm in Georgia," Sarah explained. "My father bred horses. Not at the scale of Stoneridge, but with serious intention. When I lost my family circumstances, I ended up supporting myself through whatever employment I could find. Some of that involved working with horses for people who needed the expertise. And the physician's verdict of barrenness didn't affect your willingness to put yourself forward as a candidate for marriage?" Silas asked. "No," Sarah replied. "I knew the diagnosis might be wrong. I also knew that my value wasn't limited to reproductive capacity. If you wanted a woman only for breeding, you could have bid higher at the auction and acquired someone whose fertility was more assured. The fact that you bid lower suggested you were assessing my other capabilities. I wanted to ensure you understood what those capabilities actually were." Silas set down his wineglass slowly. "You calculated that I was making a logical decision and positioned yourself accordingly. You understood the transaction in real terms, rather than in terms of desperation." "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "I was desperate, absolutely, but desperation and clear thinking aren't mutually exclusive. I understood that I had leverage you didn't necessarily recognize. That leverage was worth more than whatever romance or gratitude you might have expected. It was a conversation that established something fundamental about their relationship. They were not a couple bound by sentiment or affection, but rather two intelligent people who understood each other in terms of capability and utility. It was a foundation that would prove considerably more durable than romance might have been." By the end of her first month at Stoneridge, Sarah had begun implementing changes to both the household operations and the horse breeding program. She worked collaboratively with Eleanor rather than attempting to assert authority, and Eleanor responded by gradually accepting her as a genuine partner in management rather than as a threat. The staff seemed to respond positively to having clear guidance and defined responsibilities, and the ranch operations began to show measurable improvements in efficiency and documentation. It was during the 6th week of her residence at Stoneridge that Sarah began to suspect what her body had been indicating for several days. She was pregnant. Sarah visited Dr. Elliot in Austin on a Thursday morning in late August, traveling alone in a carriage that Silas had arranged without asking for detailed explanation of her destination. She'd mentioned casually that she needed to see the physician, and Silas had simply nodded and made the necessary arrangements. It was this quality of his, the ability to understand implication without requiring explicit explanation, that had gradually made their interactions less awkward than Sarah might have anticipated. Dr. Elliot's office was in a brick building near the center of Austin, filled with the smell of leather-bound medical texts and the faint chemical odor of various medicinal preparations. The physician himself was a man in his 60s, with silver hair and the calm demeanor of someone who'd spent decades observing the human body in all its variations and vulnerabilities. "Mrs. Thorne," he greeted her when she was shown into his examination room. "Mr. Thorne contacted me several weeks ago to ensure you'd received appropriate medical care. I assume this visit is related to a new concern?" "I believe I'm pregnant," Sarah said directly. "I wanted confirmation from someone I trust, and Mr. Thorne had indicated you were his preferred physician." Dr. Elliot conducted a thorough examination, asking detailed questions about her menstrual cycle, her physical symptoms, the timeline of when conception likely occurred. When he finished, he sat back in his chair with an expression that suggested he was processing something significant. "Congratulations, Mrs. Thorne," he said finally. "You're approximately 7 weeks along. The pregnancy appears to be progressing normally. Physically, everything indicates a healthy conception and early development." Relief washed through Sarah with an intensity that surprised her. She'd known intellectually that conception was possible, but knowing and experiencing were different things. The Boston physician's verdict of barrenness had been definitively wrong. Her body had not been broken by grief and poverty, merely dormant, waiting for the right circumstances to awaken its capacity. The Boston physicians were entirely incorrect in their assessment, Dr. Elliott continued. "There's nothing in your reproductive system that would have prevented pregnancy. Their diagnosis appears to have been based on incomplete examination and perhaps assumptions about the psychological effects of grief that weren't medically justified. You are, and apparently always were, entirely fertile." "What should I expect?" Sarah asked, moving past the vindication to practical concerns. "A normal pregnancy, if I may use that term, is approximately 9 months in duration," Dr. Elliott explained. "You'll likely experience nausea, particularly in the mornings. For the next month or two, your body will change substantially. You'll need adequate rest, appropriate nutrition, and ideally, you should avoid excessive physical exertion, particularly as the pregnancy advances. I'd like to see you monthly to monitor your progress. Beyond that, this should be straightforward, assuming no complications arise." "Will I be able to continue managing household operations and ranch activities?" Sarah asked. "You'll need to modify your level of activity," Dr. Elliott replied, "but there's no reason you can't remain engaged in management and oversight. It's the intensive physical labor that becomes problematic, particularly in the later months of pregnancy. Does Mr. Thorne understand the physical demands of pregnancy?" "I haven't informed him yet," Sarah said. "I wanted confirmation before telling him." "He should know immediately," Dr. Elliott advised. "He'll need to modify his expectations regarding your availability and your physical capacity. A man managing a ranch operation will understand demands and limitations. Mr. Thorne is pragmatic enough to adjust his expectations based on biological reality." Sarah returned to Stone Ridge in the late afternoon, traveling through the Texas hill country as the light began its descent toward evening. She'd spent the journey composing how she would inform Silas, then discarding those compositions as overthought. Silas valued clarity and directness. The simplest approach would be best. She found him in his study, reviewing correspondence and financial documents as he did most afternoons before dinner. He looked up as she entered, assessing her appearance with the quick evaluation he brought to most observations. "Dr. Elliott confirmed the pregnancy," Sarah said without preamble. "I'm approximately 7 weeks along. He indicates everything appears normal and healthy. He wants to see me monthly for monitoring, but he doesn't anticipate complications." Silas set down his pen carefully. His expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, satisfaction, something that might have been genuine pleasure. 7 weeks, he asked. That would place conception in early July. "Yes," Sarah confirmed. "The timing would be consistent with our first physical encounter following Dr. Elliott's initial examination." Silas stood and moved toward her, studying her face with an intensity that suggested he was reassessing something fundamental about her. "The Boston physicians were wrong." "Completely wrong," Sarah affirmed. "Dr. Elliott examined me thoroughly and found nothing physiologically preventing pregnancy. The barrenness diagnosis appears to have been based on incomplete examination and assumptions about grief's effects that weren't medically justified. You could have informed me of this possibility before now," Silas said, though his tone suggested observation rather than accusation. "You knew there was uncertainty. You could have stated explicitly that the diagnosis might be reversed." "I could have," Sarah agreed. "I chose not to, because the truth was that I didn't know. I suspected the diagnosis might be incomplete, but suspicion isn't certainty. I presented you with the facts as I understood them and allowed you to make decisions based on actual information rather than my hopes. I think that was the appropriate choice." Silas moved to the window, overlooking the ranch property, watching the cattle moving in the late afternoon light. 9 months from now, assuming the pregnancy proceeds normally, we'll have an heir. The original purpose of this marriage will have been fulfilled. The question now becomes what happens after that. It was a statement that acknowledged the transactional nature of their arrangement, while simultaneously suggesting that something beyond transaction was beginning to form. Zara understood his meaning. Once she'd provided the heir, the primary obligation would be completed. The question was whether he intended the marriage to continue, and on what terms. "I can continue bearing children if that's your desire," Sarah offered. "The capacity is apparently intact. How many heirs do you envision?" "That depends," Silas replied, turning from the window to face her directly. "On how your body tolerates pregnancy, on your willingness to continue bearing children, and on practical considerations about spacing. For now, let's ensure this pregnancy reaches successful conclusion. We'll discuss the future after we've experienced the reality of having an infant." Over the following weeks, as Sarah's pregnancy became undeniable, Silas's behavior toward her underwent a subtle but significant transformation. He began asking about her comfort, ensuring she had appropriate seating and support. He insisted she not overextend herself with household duties, much to Eleanor's satisfaction. The housekeeper had clearly harbored concerns about Sarah working too intensively during her delicate condition. When Sarah experienced a bout of severe nausea in her 3rd month of pregnancy, waking at odd hours and retreating to the bathing chamber, Silas began sitting with her afterward, not speaking, but maintaining a presence that was oddly comforting. It was not affection in the romantic sense, but rather a form of practical companionship, the presence of someone who understood that discomfort was temporary and who was willing to simply be present while she experienced it. The physical relationship between them, which had been utilitarian and brief in the early weeks of their marriage, began to change as well. Silas seemed to recognize that pregnancy altered Sarah's body and her capacity for physical intimacy, but rather than withdrawing from her entirely, he adapted his approach. The transactions became less about his satisfaction and more about ensuring her comfort. It was an unexpected tenderness from a man she'd initially understood as purely pragmatic. "Does this hurt?" he asked one evening, his hand resting on the swelling of her abdomen as they lay in the darkness of the master bedroom. "No," Sarah replied. "It's strange. I can feel movement sometimes. The child is becoming real in a way that wasn't true even a few weeks ago." "A son, you think?" Silas asked. "I have no way of knowing," Sarah replied. "Do you have a preference?" "A son would be simpler," Silas said. "Society would recognize a son as a legitimate heir more readily than it would a daughter. But I'm increasingly uncertain that simplicity should be my primary concern." It was an unusual admission from a man who'd built his entire life around pragmatic calculation. Sarah wondered what had prompted this shift in perspective, whether it was the reality of the pregnancy becoming undeniable, or whether experiencing Sarah's presence in his life had begun to modify his understanding of what he actually needed. In her 4th month of pregnancy, Sarah began to experience increased fatigue. Dr. Elliot had warned this was normal, but the reality of exhaustion that seemed to settle into her bones, regardless of how much sleep she received, was still startling. Eleanor observed this and made a decision that reflected her gradually warming relationship with Sarah. "You need to reduce your involvement in daily household operations," Eleanor stated one morning, finding Sarah attempting to review menus while sitting on a kitchen stool, her swollen feet propped on another chair. "Not because you're incapable, but because your body is doing something extraordinarily demanding. Your physical resources are being allocated to pregnancy. Pretending otherwise is foolish." "The staff needs direction," Sarah protested weakly. "The staff has received direction from me for the past 12 years, Eleanor replied. "They can receive direction from me for another 9 months, while your body is occupied with other purposes. You'll resume full management responsibilities after the child is born, if that's what you desire. For now, you'll rest." Eleanor's shift from polite professionalism to genuine advocacy surprised Sarah. Over the preceding months, the housekeeper had moved from viewing Sarah as a potential threat to recognizing her as a capable woman doing something legitimately difficult. The two women had developed an understanding that transcended the hierarchy of their positions. By Sarah's 5th month of pregnancy, the household had adjusted to the reality that she was unavailable for intensive labor. Eleanor managed daily operations. Sarah provided strategic oversight when her energy permitted, and Silas observed both women with the expression of a man watching a successful business operation that had initially seemed unlikely to function. It was during this period that Sarah began documenting her observations about the ranch operations, not as a formal journal, but as notes to herself about what was working, what wasn't, and what might be improved. She'd observed inefficiencies in the cattle operation that she suspected could be addressed through simple reorganization of grazing rotations. She'd noted that the horse breeding program, while generating quality stock, wasn't maximizing profit because the animals were underpriced relative to their actual value. She began sharing these observations with Silas during evening conversations, presenting them as hypotheses rather than directives. He listened carefully, asked clarifying questions, and gradually began implementing her suggestions. By the time Sarah entered her 6th month of pregnancy, visible changes were occurring in ranch operations that reflected her input. David Chen noticed this shift and mentioned it to Silas during a financial review session. According to Eleanor, who overheard the conversation while delivering correspondence to Silas's study, David had asked whether Sarah was now involved in strategic decisions about the operation. "She's offering observations," Silas had replied. "Some of them are proving valuable. Whether she's formally involved is less relevant than whether the ideas are sound. She's gained considerable authority in a brief period," David had observed carefully. "From a woman purchased at an auction to someone influencing major operational decisions, that's an unusual trajectory." "She's earned that authority through competence," Silas had responded. "I valued her for specific practical skills when I purchased her. She's demonstrated those skills and expanded beyond them. The trajectory is unusual only if you expected her to remain static in the role I initially defined." As Sarah's pregnancy advanced and her belly grew substantially larger, she found herself thinking frequently about what would happen after the child was born. She'd fulfilled the primary purpose of their transaction. The Barren woman had proven fertile, and an heir was developing according to normal progression. What happened next would define whether their marriage continued as a partnership or reverted to its transactional origins. Silas seemed to be contemplating this as well. He spent more time sitting with her in the evenings, discussing not just ranch operations but philosophy, reading passages from books in his library, engaging with her in ways that suggested he was enjoying her company for reasons beyond her utility to him. One evening, as they sat in the library and Sarah rested against cushions that supported her swollen body, Silas made a statement that seemed to encompass everything that had shifted between them since her arrival. "When I purchased you at that auction," he said, "I believed I was acquiring a solution to a specific problem. I've come to understand that I was acquiring something considerably more complex than I initially recognized. You're not just bearing an heir for me, Sarah. You're building something with me." Sarah, pregnant and fatigued and more honest than she might have been otherwise, replied simply, "I'm building something for myself. The fact that what I'm building intersects with what you're building seems to be working reasonably well." It was the most genuine assessment of their relationship either of them had offered, and Silas accepted it with a slight nod that suggested he understood precisely what she meant. The labor began on a Tuesday evening in May, exactly 9 months after conception. Sarah had been resting in the master bedroom when the first contractions arrived, not the weak, erratic movements she'd been experiencing for weeks, but genuine muscular contractions that her body recognized as the beginning of the end of pregnancy. She sent a servant to fetch Dr. Elliot, who'd established residence in the ranch house 2 days earlier in anticipation of the birth, and another servant to inform Silas that labor had begun. Eleanor arrived before Silas did, carrying supplies she'd been preparing for weeks: clean linens, basins for water, materials that would be needed regardless of how the delivery proceeded. The housekeeper's presence was steadying in a way that surprised Sarah. Eleanor had transformed from professional distance to genuine maternal concern, treating Sarah with the protectiveness of a woman who'd come to value her. "This will be difficult," Eleanor said, her tone matter-of-fact rather than alarming. "Your frame is smaller than ideal for childbirth, but you're healthy and your body has had 9 months to prepare. Women less capable than you have delivered successfully. You'll do the same." Dr. Elliot arrived within the hour and conducted an examination that confirmed Sarah's body was progressing appropriately. The cervix was dilating, the contractions were intensifying with regularity, and all indicators suggested a normal, if potentially lengthy, labor. Silas entered the bedroom as Dr. Elliot was concluding his examination. He'd changed into simpler clothing than he typically wore, as though acknowledging that the business of the day had shifted from ranching operations to something more primal and immediate. He pulled a chair close to the bed where Sarah was positioned against cushions. "I'm staying," he said, and it wasn't phrased as a question or a request for permission. "This is my child. I'll be present for its arrival." "Some men find the process disturbing, Doctor," Elliot observed carefully, uncertain whether to permit this deviation from conventional practice. "I find most things educational when approached with appropriate attention," Silas replied. "I'll remain." What followed was a labor that lasted 16 hours. Sarah experienced waves of pain that seemed to build in intensity and then recede, each contraction bringing her body closer to the moment of delivery. She moved between positions, sometimes pacing, sometimes leaning against Eleanor, sometimes lying in the bed with her eyes closed, breathing through the poured discomfort. Silas remained throughout, offering water, providing support when she needed to shift positions, speaking to her occasionally, but mostly simply maintaining his presence. He didn't attempt to minimize her experience or offer false reassurance. He simply acknowledged that she was doing something extraordinarily difficult and that she was capable of doing it. In the late afternoon of the following day, as the May sun began its descent toward evening, Sarah's body reached the point where pushing became necessary. Dr. Elliot provided clear instruction, Eleanor supported her from behind, and Silas watched with an intensity that suggested he was witnessing something that fundamentally altered his understanding of what physical human capability could encompass. The child emerged after 2 hours of active pushing a son, healthy and robust, with a cry that announced his arrival with considerable volume. He was placed immediately on Sarah's chest, while Dr. Elliot attended to the remaining medical necessities. The infant's skin was streaked with birth fluid, his eyes squeezed shut against the light of the world, but his vitality was undeniable. Silas leaned forward and looked at his son with an expression that contained wonder and something approaching vulnerability. He extended one finger, and the infant grasped it reflexively, a small human hand closing around his father's hand in a gesture that seemed to encompass everything about the transaction between them that had now produced an actual human being. "He's perfect," Silas said, his voice rough in a way Sarah hadn't heard before. "You did it, Sarah. You actually did it." "We did it," Sarah replied, correcting him without defensiveness. "This was both of us." Silas remained in the bedroom while Eleanor and Dr. Elliot managed the immediate postpartum care. Sarah delivered the placenta without complication, and Dr. Elliot examined both mother and child to ensure all was progressing appropriately. "Everything appears normal," Dr. Elliot announced after completing his examination. "Mrs. Thorne, you've done remarkably well. The delivery was difficult, as I anticipated given your frame, but you managed it with excellent strength. The child is healthy. Now you need rest and recovery time. I'll want to see you in a week to ensure the healing is proceeding appropriately." Over the following days, as Sarah recovered from the physical demands of childbirth, the household adjusted to the arrival of an infant. Silas named the child William, after his paternal grandfather, and seemed unable to stop himself from visiting the nursery at frequent intervals to observe his son. Eleanor had hired a wet nurse, a woman named Catherine, whose own infant had been born 2 weeks earlier and who had substantial breast milk available, but Silas seemed to want involvement that went beyond simply ensuring the child was fed and cared for. He spent hours with William, holding him awkwardly at first, but gradually becoming more comfortable with the physical reality of supporting an infant. He discussed his hopes for his son with a vulnerability that Sarah recognized as unusual for a man who typically conducted his life with complete emotional control. "I want him to have choices," Silas said one evening while sitting in the nursery as Sarah rested in the master bedroom. "Not simply to inherit the ranch, because it's expected. I want him to develop his own capabilities, make his own decisions about what he wants his life to be." "He's 3 days old," Eleanor observed, sitting in a chair nearby and working on mending while she monitored the infant. "His primary decision right now is whether to sleep or demand feeding." "I understand that," Silas replied, "but the foundation for who he becomes is being established now. The decisions I make about how to raise him, how to educate him, what I expect from him, these shape his capacity to choose for himself later." Sarah, when she heard about this conversation from Eleanor, found herself reassessing her understanding of Silas in ways that went beyond what she'd already recognized. She'd known him as pragmatic, as capable, as intelligent, but she hadn't fully appreciated his capacity for genuine reflection about the kind of father and man he wanted to be. By the time Sarah reached the 2-week mark of recovery, Dr. Elliot had confirmed that her healing was proceeding without complication. She was able to move around the house without significant pain, though she was easily fatigued, and her body remained substantially changed from the pregnancy and delivery. It was during this period of recovery that Silas broached the topic that had been implicit between them since William's birth. What would happen next regarding additional children? "You need time to recover," he said one evening, sitting in the library where Sarah had retreated to rest while Eleanor monitored William. Dr. Elliot suggested a minimum of 3 months before considering another pregnancy, though he indicated that spacing of 6 months or longer would be more medically advisable. "Are you asking me about my willingness to become pregnant again?" Sarah asked directly. "I'm informing you of what Dr. Elliot indicated and asking you to consider what you want," Silas replied. "The original arrangement was that you would bear children. William's arrival fulfilled that initial commitment. What happens now should depend on your assessment of your own capacity and willingness, not simply on my desires." "You wanted multiple heirs," Sarah observed. "That hasn't changed, I assume." "My desire for heirs hasn't changed," Silas confirmed, "but my understanding of what that desire requires has evolved. Bearing children comes with significant physical cost to you. I'm not certain I'm willing to demand that cost repeatedly without your genuine agreement that the cost is worth what you gain from it." It was a question that required Sarah to examine her own feelings about pregnancy, about motherhood, about her role in Silas's life beyond reproduction. She'd experienced the physical difficulty of pregnancy, the nausea, the exhaustion, the discomfort. She'd also experienced the labor, which had been genuinely painful and had pushed her body to its limits. These were not trivial costs. But she'd also experienced William, the weight of him in her arms, the reality of having created a human being, the visceral connection that came from nursing him and watching him respond to her presence. That experience had not been trivial either. "I'm willing to bear more children," Sarah said after considerable thought, "but not indefinitely. I want spacing between pregnancies, genuine spacing, not rushed conception. And I want to continue being involved in the ranch operations and strategic decisions. Motherhood doesn't eliminate my other capacities." "Agreed," Silas said. "We'll wait until you're fully recovered, at least 6 months. Beyond that, we'll allow conception to occur naturally without forcing it through artificial pressure, and your involvement in the ranch operations will continue. I'll need to adjust the household arrangements to ensure you have time for both responsibilities." This conversation represented something significant, an evolution beyond transaction into genuine negotiation about the terms of their partnership. Sarah was no longer accepting terms defined by Silas. She was defining her own terms and requiring that he honor them. Over the following weeks, as Sarah's physical recovery progressed, she began returning to her various responsibilities. Eleanor continued to manage primary household operations, but Sarah resumed strategic oversight. She began visiting the horse breeding facilities again, observing the animals and mentally considering how the program could be refined. She also began spending time with William, though she'd hired Catherine as the primary caregiver. The infant's feeding schedule was established around Catherine's nursing capacity, but the emotional bonding and physical care fell to both the nurse and Sarah herself. Silas seemed to appreciate that Sarah had found a way to be a mother without it consuming her entire identity and availability. By the time William reached 4 months of age, Sarah had begun to notice the subtle early signs that her body was beginning to contemplate pregnancy again. Her menstrual cycle had resumed approximately 2 months postpartum, as Dr. Elliot had indicated it likely would. By the 4th month after William's birth, she observed the slight changes in her breasts, the shift in her appetite, the increased fatigue that suggested her body was preparing for conception even before actual pregnancy had been confirmed. She informed Silas one evening with the same directness that had characterized their previous conversations. "I believe I'm pregnant again," she said. "The signs are subtle, but they're present. I should see Dr. Elliot to confirm, but I wanted you to know my assessment first." Silas set down the financial documents he'd been reviewing. "It's only been 4 months since William's birth. We agreed on 6 months minimum." "I'm aware of what we agreed," Sarah replied. "My body appears to have different intentions. Pregnancies occurring closer together than planned happens more frequently than we might prefer. The question is how we respond to that biological reality." "How do you want to respond?" Silas asked. "You could decline to continue the pregnancy. There are methods available if you want to prevent it from developing further." "I could," Sarah acknowledged, "but I don't want to. I'm stronger now than I was before William's birth. I understand the physical demands. I'm willing to proceed with another pregnancy, though I want to be clear that I'm doing this by choice, not obligation." "That's understood," Silas said, "though I'll acknowledge I'm concerned about the physical toll of such rapid, successive pregnancies." "You should be," Sarah replied. "The toll is real, but the capacity to bear it is also real. I'm a different woman than I was before William. I understand my own body better. I'm going to proceed with this pregnancy, and I'm going to trust that you'll support my decisions about how to manage it." Dr. Elliot, when he examined Sarah 2 weeks later, confirmed the pregnancy. He expressed medical concerns about the rapid spacing, but he also acknowledged that Sarah's recovery from the first pregnancy had been exceptional and that she appeared in excellent physical condition. "Some women's bodies are simply suited for rapid successive pregnancies," Dr. Elliot explained. "Your recovery has been notably healthy. You're eating well, your strength has returned, your overall constitution is robust. If you're willing to proceed, I don't see medical reason to prevent it, though I want you to understand the physical cost will accumulate." "I understand," Sarah said. "I want to proceed." As she made the journey back to Stonebridge, Sarah reflected on the trajectory that had brought her to this point. Less than a year ago, she'd been standing on a platform in an auction house, being sold for $3 to a man she'd never met. She'd been declared barren by physicians, deemed unlikely to fulfill the primary function she was being purchased to provide. Now she was carrying a second child, having proven not only that she could conceive, but that her body was remarkably capable of bearing children successfully. She'd transformed from a desperate woman, accepting the only option available to her, into a partner negotiating terms with Silas, making decisions about her own body and her own future. The $3 transaction had set in motion something neither of them had fully anticipated, not simply the creation of heirs, but the creation of a genuine partnership between two people who'd begun with purely practical motivations and had gradually discovered that capability and respect could evolve into something far more substantial. By the spring of 1902, Sarah had given birth to 5 children in 4 years. After William came James, born when William was barely 11 months old. Then came Robert, arriving when Sarah was already pregnant with her 4th child. Elizabeth was born 2 years after James, a daughter who surprised everyone by possessing her father's calculating temperament in a female form. And most recently, in the winter of 1902, came Thomas, a healthy boy who'd arrived during a snowstorm that had nearly claimed Sarah's life during the difficult delivery. The pace of pregnancies had left little room for recovery between conceptions. Sarah would barely reach 6 months postpartum before finding herself pregnant again, her body moving from one cycle of gestation to the next with barely enough time to re-establish physical stability between pregnancies. The cumulative effect was visible to anyone who understood how to look. The woman who'd arrived at Stonebridge Ranch 3 years earlier, strong and capable with the physical presence of someone accustomed to physical labor, had gradually transformed. Her face, once striking in its strength, had become thinner, marked with lines that spoke to years of strain compressed into a few short years. Her body, which had recovered beautifully after William's birth, now showed the accumulated impact of multiple pregnancies in rapid succession. Her frame, already smaller than ideal for childbearing, had been strained repeatedly beyond optimal capacity. Yet, despite the physical toll, Sarah had refused to withdraw from her responsibilities beyond what was absolutely necessary. She managed the household through Eleanor, reviewed strategic decisions about the ranch operations, and maintained her involvement in the horse breeding program through David Chen and a young manager named Frederick, who'd proven himself capable of implementing her vision for the Bees Do operation. Dr. Elliot had become a nearly permanent fixture at Stonebridge, arriving each month to monitor Sarah's health and expressing increasing medical concern about the rapid succession of pregnancies. After Thomas's difficult birth in the winter of 1902, he'd had a serious conversation with both Sarah and Silas. Another pregnancy in the immediate term could genuinely threaten her life. Dr. Elliot had stated flatly, sitting in Silas's study with unusual gravity. The physical cost of 5 pregnancies in 4 years is substantial. Her body needs recovery time. If she becomes pregnant again within the next year, we're genuinely gambling with her survival. I understand the medical reality. Sarah had replied, though her voice was exhausted in a way that suggested the understanding came more from physical experience than from intellectual knowledge. My body will do what it does. I can't prevent pregnancy through sheer force of will. You can, Dr. Elliot had said carefully. There are methods. They're not foolproof, but they exist. I'm suggesting that you consider them. It was a conversation that had brought Silas and Sarah to a critical juncture in their marriage. What had begun as a transaction, a man purchasing a woman specifically to bear children, had evolved into something more complex, but the underlying assumption remained: Sarah's primary value to Silas was her reproductive capacity. That assumption was about to be challenged fundamentally. The household had expanded substantially to manage the reality of 5 children under 5 years old. Beyond Catherine, the original wet nurse, there were now 2 additional nurses, a nanny who managed the older children's education and daily care, a laundress dedicated entirely to managing the enormous volume of soiled linens and clothing that came with multiple young children, and additional kitchen staff to ensure adequate nutrition for the expanding household. The costs were substantial, but Silas had absorbed them without complaint, understanding that raising multiple children required resources and attention that extended far beyond what a single person or even 2 people could manage. Eleanor had evolved into something approaching a household manager and strategist, coordinating the efforts of a staff that had grown from 12 to nearly 25 people. It was Eleanor who first addressed the reality that Sarah's body was sending increasingly clear signals about its limits. She found Sarah one afternoon attempting to review the household accounts while simultaneously managing a fussy Thomas and ensuring that Robert, who'd developed an unfortunate habit of climbing where he shouldn't, didn't injure himself. The housekeeper observed this scene for a long moment, then gently but firmly closed the ledger. "You need to stop," Eleanor said simply. "Stop what?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the exhaustion of someone running on inadequate resources. "Stop trying to do everything," Eleanor replied. "Stop managing household operations while managing 5 children under 5. Stop reviewing financial documents while you're barely able to keep your eyes open. Stop pretending that you can continue at this pace without something giving. The household needs management," Sarah replied, but her protest was weak. "The household has me," Eleanor said. "I'm capable of managing daily operations. I'm also capable of managing strategic decisions about food purchasing, staff scheduling, and household efficiency. I've been doing these things reasonably well. You don't need to duplicate my work while simultaneously being pregnant with regularity and recovering from childbirth." Sarah felt tears prick her eyes, surprising herself with the intensity of the emotional response. "Silas wanted—" "I know what Silas wanted," Eleanor interrupted gently. "He wanted children, and you've given him 5 healthy children in 4 years, which is considerably more than most men acquire in a lifetime. What he didn't want, I suspect, is a wife who collapses from exhaustion or dies from complication of pregnancy. The man is pragmatic enough to understand that losing you would be a far worse outcome than whatever household management functions you're currently attempting to maintain." Eleanor's intervention prompted a direct conversation between Sarah and Silas that neither of them had initiated, though both had been contemplating it with increasing intensity. "Doctor, Elliot believes another pregnancy in the next 12 months could be life-threatening," Sarah said bluntly one evening. "He suggested there are methods to prevent conception. Eleanor has suggested I stop attempting to manage household operations while bearing children in rapid succession. They're both saying things I suspect you're also thinking but haven't stated directly." "I'm thinking them," Silas confirmed. "I'm also thinking that you've already fulfilled the primary purpose of our marriage far beyond any reasonable expectation. 5 healthy children, that was supposed to be my life goal. You've provided that in 4 years. What happens now should be your decision, not my requirement." "You don't want more children?" Sarah asked, surprised by the shift in his position. "I do," Silas admitted, "but not at the cost of your life or your health. The mathematics of this situation are becoming unfavorable. Each additional pregnancy increases risk. The value of additional children decreases relative to that risk. I'm not certain the equation balances anymore." "So, what are you proposing?" Sarah asked. "I'm proposing that we consider the possibility of spacing longer between pregnancies," Silas said carefully. "That we explore the methods Dr. Elliot mentioned. That we allow your body to genuinely recover rather than moving from one pregnancy to the next." and that you step back from household management entirely, allowing Eleanor to manage those operations while you focus on recovery and the Tekkens, children who've already been born. If I stop being involved in ranch operations, if I stop contributing beyond bearing children, Sarah began, then you'll have shifted your contribution from continuous availability to the specific contribution of bearing children. Silas interrupted. That's not diminishment, Sarah. That's acknowledging the extraordinary physical demands of rapid successive pregnancies while you're recovering from the previous pregnancies. You've been trying to do 3 full-time jobs simultaneously. That's not sustainable. The conversation led to a fundamental restructuring of Sarah's responsibilities. Eleanor assumed complete control of household management. Frederick, the young breeding program manager, was given formal authority to make operational decisions about the horse operation, though he continued to consult with Sarah on strategic questions. Sarah's role shifted to something that looked like less work but was, in many ways, more valuable strategic, thinking about long-term development rather than daily management. Most significantly, Sarah and Silas consulted with Dr. Elliot about methods to space pregnancies. The medical options available in 1902 were limited, but they existed certain herbal preparations that some midwives recommended, careful attention to timing, and frankly, less frequent physical intimacy, which Dr. Elliot suggested might be the most reliable method. Nature will do what it intends to do, Dr. Elliot explained. But reducing the frequency of intercourse obviously reduces the probability of conception. If you want to space pregnancies, reducing physical frequency is the most reliable method available. The shift created an unexpected intimacy between Sarah and Silas. With less frequent physical encounters, those encounters became more intentional, more focused on connection rather than obligation. Sarah found herself actually enjoying the physical relationship in ways she hadn't during the years of relentless pregnancy and recovery. Over the following year, as Sarah's body finally received genuine recovery time, the physical changes became visible. Color returned to her face. The lines that stress and exhaustion had carved into her features softened slightly. She regained energy, the capacity to engage with her children without feeling drained by the effort, and the mental clarity that had become increasingly elusive during the years of rapid pregnancies. By 1903, approximately a year after Thomas's difficult birth, Sarah discovered she was pregnant again. The pregnancy had been planned for, anticipated, accepted into the rhythm that had become the pattern of her life. But unlike the previous pregnancies, which had arrived almost as biological inevitabilities, this one felt different. It had been chosen deliberately, entered into with intention rather than surprise. The child born from this pregnancy was a daughter whom they named Catherine after the wet nurse who'd been so essential to managing the household. Catherine's arrival, when Sarah was less physically exhausted than she'd been during previous pregnancies, proceeded smoothly. And for the first time, Sarah experienced pregnancy and recovery as something other than a relentless biological obligation. By 1904, she had borne her 7th child, another son, David, named for the financial manager who'd become something approaching a family member through his long association with Silas and the ranch operations. In 1905 came twins, Virginia and Samuel, born after a pregnancy that had progressed with unexpected ease and a delivery that had been surprisingly uncomplicated given the reality of carrying 2 infants simultaneously. And in 1906, when Sarah was 34 years old and Silas was 60, she delivered her 9th child, a daughter, Margaret, who was born healthy and robust, as though to demonstrate that Sarah's body, when given appropriate spacing and recovery time, remained fully capable of bearing children successfully. 9 children in 10 years, but not in the relentless, uncontrolled succession that could have killed her. 9 children spaced over a decade in ways that allowed recovery, maintained Sarah's health, and permitted her to be genuinely present for the children who'd already been born, rather than consumed entirely by the biological demands of reproduction. The shift in pace had changed something fundamental about Sarah's experience of motherhood. Rather than being a process that happened to her while she attempted to maintain other responsibilities, motherhood became something she could genuinely engage with. She knew her children as individuals with distinct personalities and needs. She participated in their development rather than merely ensuring their survival. William, her oldest, was now 8 years old and had inherited his father's analytical mind. James, at 7, was showing genuine talent for animal husbandry and working with horses. Robert was a sensitive child who seemed to notice when people were troubled and offered comfort with surprising maturity for a 6-year-old. Elizabeth, at 5, possessed a calculating temperament that suggested she'd be formidable at whatever she chose to do. Thomas, at 3, was a charmer who could convince anyone to provide him with exactly what he wanted through a combination of intelligence and affection. Catherine, the 2-year-old named for the wet nurse, possessed an unusual combination of her mother's physical competence and her father's business acumen. The twins, Virginia and Samuel, at 1-year-old, were already demonstrating distinct personalities. Virginia quiet and observant, Samuel robust and social. And Margaret, the youngest, was still primarily focused on eating and sleeping, but gave every indication of being a healthy, thriving infant. More significantly, Sarah had survived the experience of bearing 9 children in 10 years, not only physically, but emotionally, and 2000, intellectually intact. She remained engaged with the ranch operations at a strategic level. She maintained the horse breeding program vision through Frederick and periodic consultations. She participated in decisions about land development and financial investments that had become increasingly sophisticated as Silas's wealth had accumulated. She was not defined solely by motherhood, though motherhood was undeniably central to her life. She was a woman who'd transformed from purchased commodity into genuine partner, from barren woman declared incapable of bearing children into a mother of 9, from someone with no authority in a household into a woman whose opinions shaped strategic decisions about one of the largest ranches in Texas. And Silas, observing all of this, he had begun to understand that the $3 investment in a woman declared barren, he had been the most valuable decision he'd ever made. Not because she'd produced the heirs he'd sought, though she'd certainly done that, but because she'd forced him to expand his understanding of partnership, to recognize competence and capability that transcended reproductive function, and to build something with a woman that was far more substantial than the simple transaction he'd originally imagined. In the autumn of 1907, when Sarah's youngest daughter Margaret was approaching her 2nd birthday, a situation began unfolding in the Texas Hill Country that would test the partnership Sarah and Silas had constructed and force Sarah into a position where her capabilities would become essential to preserving not just their family, but Silas's reputation and standing in the region. A neighboring rancher named Augustus Cross, whose property bordered the eastern edge of Stoneridge's land, began experiencing unusual cattle losses. At first, the losses seemed random, and scattered animals disappearing from different pastures, the disappearances suggesting either predators or disease rather than deliberate theft. But as weeks passed and the losses continued, a pattern began to emerge that suggested something far more sinister than natural causes. The animals being lost were consistently from Augustus's highest quality stock, breeding cattle with valuable bloodlines, animals that represented significant financial investment, and they were disappearing in ways that suggested intentional removal rather than natural predation. Within 6 weeks, Augustus had lost over 60 head of premium cattle, losses that represented tens of thousands of dollars. Augustus arrived at Stoneridge one afternoon in late October, his demeanor suggesting barely contained anger. He requested a meeting with Silas, and the conversation that followed was confrontational in ways that surprised Eleanor, who observed the men meeting in Silas's study and reported the tone to Sarah. "Mr. Cross is accusing Mr. Thorne of stealing his cattle, Eleanor stated flatly. He's suggesting that Mr. Thorne might be deliberately eliminating competition or acquiring superior genetics without purchase. Sarah, who was sitting in the library reviewing accounts with Frederick, the horse breeding manager, had increasingly become involved in broader ranch financial analysis, looked up sharply. "That's absurd," Frederick said immediately. "Mr. Thorne has no need to steal cattle. His herds are substantial. His finances are more than adequate." "Accusations of theft are based on desperation rather than logic," Sarah replied quietly. "Mr. Cross is losing animals he can't afford to lose. He's looking for someone to blame. Silas, being the most prominent rancher in the region, is a logical target for that blame." By evening, Silas had confirmed Eleanor's report. He presented the situation to Sarah with the pragmatic directness that characterized his approach to problems. "Augustus Cross believes I'm stealing his cattle," Silas stated. "He suggested that I'm either acquiring the animals for my own herds or perhaps sabotaging his operation to eliminate competition. Both accusations are false, but the fact that he's making them suggests something is genuinely wrong with his operation. Either someone is actually stealing from him, or he's experiencing something he's misinterpreting as theft." "What do you want to do?" Sarah asked. "I want to investigate," Silas replied. "I want to understand what's actually happening and who's responsible. But I'm aware that my investigation would be viewed with suspicion. A man accused of a crime investigating the crime itself has obvious credibility problems." Sarah understood immediately what Silas was implying without directly stating it. He needed someone to conduct the investigation, someone whose credibility wasn't compromised by the accusation, someone whose observations would be valued precisely because they came from outside the direct conflict. "You want me to investigate," Sarah said. "I want you to observe," Silas replied. "You understand animals, you understand ranching operations, and you understand how people think. You've shown those capabilities repeatedly. I'm asking if you're willing to use them now." Over the following weeks, Sarah began a careful investigation into Augustus Cross's cattle losses. She visited the neighboring ranch on the pretext of discussing potential breeding stock acquisition, a plausible excuse given that Stoneridge had been acquiring select animals from various breeders. She observed the operation, asked questions about the specific animals that had gone missing, and listened carefully to the explanations provided. What she discovered was that Augustus's ranch management was significantly less sophisticated than Silas's. The record-keeping was poor, the organization of grazing pastures was haphazard, and the personnel managing day-to-day operations seemed inadequately supervised. But none of that necessarily suggested cattle were being stolen. Working with David Chen, Sarah began researching the specific animals that had gone missing. She requested information from various cattle brokers about recent purchases of high-quality stock, cross-referencing bloodlines and identifying characteristics with the animals Augustus claimed to have lost. What emerged from this research was that approximately 30 of the 60 animals Augustus believed had been stolen had actually been purchased through legitimate cattle brokers, purchased by a man named Vincent Garrett, who operated a small ranch operation about 40 miles from Stoneridge. The purchases had been made over several months, and the transactions had been documented in standard business records. Sarah presented her findings to Silas with careful documentation of her research process. "Approximately half of Augustus's losses can be traced to legitimate purchases," Sarah explained, spreading documents across Silas's study. "Vincent Garrett has been acquiring quality animals from various sources over the past several months. The question is, where those animals came from before Garrett purchased them." "And the other 30 animals?" Silas asked. "More difficult to trace," Sarah admitted. "But the pattern suggests they may have been sold through intermediaries, brokers, or smaller dealers who purchased from Augustus without informing him of the transactions." If someone with knowledge of Augustus's herds was selling them to brokers, who then sold them to dealers like Garrett, Augustus would perceive them as stolen, while they were actually being systematically diverted away from his control. Who would have knowledge of Augustus's herds and access to remove animals? Silas asked. Someone on his staff, Sarah replied. Someone with legitimate reason to be in the pastures, someone trusted enough that their presence wouldn't be questioned. I'd recommend investigating his ranch hands and managers. Silas acted on Sarah's analysis by meeting directly with Augustus and presenting her findings, rather than presenting it as Silas's own analysis, which would have been viewed with suspicion given the accusation of theft. Silas introduced Sarah to Augustus and let her present the research herself. Augustus received Sarah with the respect a man typically shows a woman of her position, but his initial skepticism was evident. Sarah walked him through her research methodology, explained how she'd traced the animals, and demonstrated the documentation she'd accumulated. By the time she finished, Augustus's skepticism had shifted towards something approaching acceptance. "Your wife conducted this investigation?" Augustus asked Silas, his tone suggesting surprise. "My wife observed your operation, asked appropriate questions, and conducted financial research," Silas replied. "She also suggested investigating your staff, which I suspect will prove to be the source of your problem." Investigation of Augustus's ranch staff revealed that his assistant manager, a man named Harold, who'd worked for Augustus for 5 years, had been systematically diverting animals from the herds and selling them to brokers for personal profit. Harold had been exploiting Augustus's poor record-keeping and inadequate oversight to remove premium animals with minimal risk of immediate detection. Over several months, Harold had personally profited approximately $8,000 from these thefts. When confronted with the evidence, Harold confessed and was arrested. The experience vindicated Silas completely, while simultaneously demonstrating to Augustus and, by extension, to the broader ranching community in the Texas Hill Country, that Silas Thorne's integrity was intact and his business practices were sound. More significantly, the experience demonstrated something else, that Silas Thorne was married to a woman of genuine intellectual capability and analytical skill. Sarah had become visible in the community, not as a wife and mother, but as someone whose thinking solved complex problems. Augustus Cross, having been forced to confront the reality that his own mismanagement and inadequate supervision had created the conditions for theft, became something approaching a genuine friend to Silas and Sarah. He recommended their breeding stock to other ranchers. He sought Sarah's advice on improving his ranch management practices. And, most significantly, he began telling the story of the woman purchased for $3 who solved a crisis. Her husband's reputation had made him unable to investigate directly. The story spread through the Texas ranching community with remarkable speed. Within months, Sarah's reputation as someone of analytical capability and practical thinking extended far beyond Stone Ridge's immediate region. Women began seeking her advice on business matters. Other ranchers consulted with her about operational improvements. Agricultural journals began requesting interviews with her about breeding practices and ranch management. For Silas, the experience represented a profound validation of his decision to marry Sarah and, more importantly, his decision to involve her in the broader operations of Stone Ridge despite the unconventional nature of such involvement. He'd invested $3 in a woman declared Barren, and in the process had acquired a partner whose capabilities extended far beyond what either of them had initially anticipated. For Sarah, the experience represented something equally significant: recognition that her value to Silas and to the broader community extended far beyond her reproductive capacity. She was not simply the mother of his 9 children. She was a woman whose analytical thinking, whose careful observation, and whose willingness to engage with complex problems could have real impact on the world around her. In the aftermath of the crisis resolution, Sarah made a decision that would further expand her influence. She began documenting her observations about ranch management, not as a formal publication, but as a series of letters to other ranchers who requested her advice. These letters were practical, detailed, and focused on solving specific problems that others were experiencing. Frederick, the breeding program manager, suggested that these letters be compiled and potentially published in agricultural journals. Your observations about breeding protocols, about record keeping, about identifying inefficiencies in ranch operations. These are valuable not just to individuals, but to the broader ranching industry, Frederick explained. You could influence how people manage cattle and horses across the entire region. I'm not a writer, Sarah replied. I'm a rancher's wife, managing a household and children. You're a woman who solved a major crisis through analytical thinking, Frederick replied. That same capability could be expressed through writing. I think you should consider it. By the winter of 1908, Sarah had begun corresponding with the editor of a Texas agricultural journal about the possibility of publishing a series of articles on ranch management based on her observations and experience. The editor, a man named Robert Harrison, who'd heard the story of Sarah's role in the Augustus Cross crisis, was enthusiastic about the possibility. Women's voices are largely absent from agricultural discussion, Robert explained in his correspondence with Sarah. The assumption is that agriculture is a man's domain. Your perspective as a woman managing both a sophisticated operation and a household of 9 children would be genuinely valuable. I'd like to feature your observations. Silas, when Sarah informed him of the potential publication opportunity, responded with characteristic pragmatism. If you want to write for the journals, write. If your observations help other ranchers improve their operations, that benefits the entire industry. And it certainly benefits your reputation and our family's standing. It's unconventional, Sarah observed. Women don't typically publish in agricultural journals. Neither do women typically investigate cattle theft or solve crimes their husbands can't investigate themselves, Silas replied. Unconventional seems to suit you well. I'd encourage you to continue in that direction. By the spring of 1909, Sarah's first article appeared in the Texas Agricultural Journal, titled Systematic Documentation in Cattle Operations, Creating Infrastructure for Growth. The article was practical and detailed, explaining how careful record-keeping, organized personnel management, and consistent evaluation of herd genetics could dramatically improve profitability and efficiency. It was signed simply S. Thorne, Stone Ridge Ranch, Texas, without elaboration on her identity as a woman. The article generated significant response from readers. Several ranchers wrote requesting clarification on specific points. The journal editor received inquiries about whether other articles might be forthcoming, and within months, ranchers across Texas were requesting copies of the article to share with their managers and staff. Eleanor, observing these developments while managing the household that now included 9 children and a staff of over 30 people, reflected on the remarkable transformation she'd witnessed. The woman who'd arrived at Stone Ridge 6 years earlier as a desperate commodity purchased at an auction had become someone whose thinking influenced the agricultural practices of an entire region. Mr. Thorne made an excellent investment, Eleanor remarked to Sarah one afternoon as they reviewed household accounts together. $3 for a woman who's given him 9 children and rebuilt his reputation and influenced ranching practices across Texas. That's remarkable return on investment. The investment was in my capability to produce children, Sarah replied. Everything else has been unexpected development. The investment was in you, Eleanor corrected gently. Mr. Thorne is many things, but he's not a man who makes investments blindly. He recognized something in you at that auction, even if he couldn't articulate what. Everything that's followed has been development of what was already there. Sarah reflected on Eleanor's assessment as she sat in the library one evening, reviewing page proofs of her second article. which would be published in the Summer Agricultural Journal. 9 years had passed since the marriage auction. She'd borne 9 children, experienced the physical toll of rapid successive pregnancies, and gradually transformed from a desperate woman accepting the only option available into a partner whose observations and thinking influenced decisions that extended far beyond the boundaries of Stoneridge Ranch. The $3 transaction that had seemed humiliating and desperate now appeared in her retrospective consideration as something far more complex. An exchange of value between two people whose capabilities complemented each other in ways neither of them had initially anticipated. She was no longer the barren woman society had deemed worthless. She was the mother of 9, the partner of a wealthy rancher, and increasingly the voice of practical thinking in an agricultural world that had largely ignored women's perspectives. The path from auction platform to agricultural journal author had been difficult, demanding, and full of physical and emotional cost. But it had also been a remarkable journey of discovery about what was actually possible when desperation combined with capability and met someone willing to evolve beyond his initial assumptions. By 1910, Sarah had published 5 articles in various agricultural journals. Her observations about cattle breeding, ranch management efficiency, and personnel organization had become recognized as authoritative within the industry. She'd been approached by ranchers across Texas, Oklahoma, and Colorado seeking her consultation on specific operational challenges. Several had offered substantial fees for her analysis and recommendations. She'd declined most offers, but she'd begun accepting a select few, not for financial necessity, but because the intellectual engagement satisfied something in her that 9 years of motherhood and household management, while deeply fulfilling, hadn't entirely addressed. It was during this period of expanding recognition that an opportunity emerged that would fundamentally alter the trajectory of Sarah's life and, consequently, the future of the Stoneridge operation. A consortium of wealthy investors from Denver had been developing a large cattle operation in Colorado. The operation was encountering significant challenges, breeding programs that weren't producing desired genetic outcomes, management structures that were creating inefficiencies, and personnel conflicts that suggested poor leadership development. The investors, having read Sarah's articles and heard about her role in solving the Augustus Cross situation, sent a formal inquiry to Silas requesting Sarah's consultation on a 6-month engagement. The offer included substantial compensation, relocation accommodations in Denver, and authority to implement whatever recommendations she deemed necessary. It was, in many ways, an extraordinary opportunity recognition of her expertise at a level few women of her era experienced, and the chance to shape a major operation from its foundations. When Silas presented the opportunity to Sarah, he did so with the careful neutrality of a man who understood the significance of what he was offering her. "They want you, not me," Silas stated, sitting with Sarah in the library one afternoon while the younger children were occupied with their tutors. "They want your analysis, your recommendations, your involvement in shaping their operation. They're willing to pay $15,000 for 6 months of your time." "That's extraordinary compensation," Sarah replied, understanding immediately that the offer represented far more than financial opportunity. It represented recognition of her value as an independent professional, not simply as a rancher's wife. "It is," Silas confirmed. "And it's also a decision that affects 9 children in this household. I'm not going to accept it for you. But I want you to understand what's being offered and to consider whether you want to pursue it." "If I did this," Sarah began carefully, "it would require me to leave Stoneridge for 6 months. It would require the household to function without me." "Eleanor is entirely capable of managing the household," Silas replied. "The children are old enough that your absence would be noted and possibly difficult for them, but it wouldn't be catastrophic. Catherine is 8 years old, capable of helping manage younger siblings. Eleanor can coordinate with various staff to ensure everything functions properly. And I can provide parental presence even if I'm managing ranching operations simultaneously. You're not saying I should go, Sarah observed. I'm saying I won't prevent you from going if you decide that's what you want, Silas replied. Your life is not limited to being my wife and the mother of our children, though both those roles are important. You have capabilities that are being recognized and valued. The question is, what you want to do with those capabilities. Sarah took 3 days to consider the offer. She spent time with each of her children, observing them, understanding their needs, assessing whether her absence for 6 months would genuinely harm them, or whether it would simply be a different arrangement than what they'd become accustomed to. She consulted with Eleanor about the household's capacity to function without her direct management. She examined her own motivations. Was she fleeing the demands of motherhood, or was she genuinely interested in the intellectual challenge of the Colorado operation? When she finally reached her decision, it came from a place of clarity rather than uncertainty. I want to do this, she told Silas, but not on the terms they've offered. I want a different arrangement. I want to establish a formal business partnership with you, not marriage, not just wife of the owner, but actual partnership in the Stone Ridge operations. I want to formalize my authority over breeding program decisions, invest my own capital in the breeding stock, and establish a separate profit participation that belongs entirely to me. Once I've established that formal structure here, I'll go to Colorado. But I won't go as a hired consultant, coming back to a position where I'm dependent on your authority. It was a significant request, and Silas understood its implications immediately. Sarah was not simply asking for recognition of what she was already doing. She was asking for formal acknowledgement of her as a partner in the Stone Ridge operation, with her own capital, her own authority, and her own financial stake in the success of the business. I'll need to consult with David Chen about the structure, Silas replied, but the principle is acceptable to me. You've earned that partnership through capability and contribution. Let's formalize it appropriately. Over the following month, David Chen worked with Silas and Sarah to structure a formal business partnership agreement. Sarah would contribute her knowledge and expertise regarding breeding program development. Silas would contribute capital and provide overall operational authority. They would establish Sarah's capital investment in the breeding stock at a level that reflected her intellectual contribution and would create a profit-sharing arrangement that was genuinely separate from household resources. The agreement was documented and formalized with the same legal precision that would characterize any business partnership. Sarah was no longer simply the wife of the owner, contributing her knowledge as part of her household responsibilities. She was a business partner with documented authority, financial stake, and profit participation. This is unusual, David had observed while reviewing the final documentation. A married couple operating a formal business partnership is not standard practice. Nothing about this marriage has been standard practice, Silas replied. Sarah isn't a standard wife. Our arrangement isn't a standard arrangement. Formalizing it in business terms seems appropriate. With the partnership formalized, Sarah accepted the Colorado engagement. In the spring of 1910, she made the journey to Denver with detailed documentation about breeding practices, a carefully packed wardrobe suitable for business engagement, and a commitment to return to Stone Ridge within 6 months. The Colorado operation was considerably more substantial than she'd anticipated. The investors had assembled impressive physical infrastructure, barns, corrals, facilities for managing several thousand head of cattle. But the operation itself was chaotic. Records were poorly maintained, personnel were operating without clear structure or authority, and the breeding program was unsystematic, producing animals that ranged from excellent to substandard, with no clear understanding of what variables were producing the variation. Sarah spent her first month simply observing and documenting. She walked the facilities, examined the cattle, reviewed the breeding records, and interviewed the managers and staff about their understanding of how decisions were being made. By the end of the month, she'd identified the fundamental problems and had begun formulating recommendations. The investors had expected her to provide written analysis and recommendations that they could then implement. Instead, Sarah insisted on direct authority to implement changes herself. Recommendations without implementation accountability create incomplete solutions, she explained to the investor consortium. I'm willing to remain engaged through 6 months of aside. Actual operational management, implementing the recommendations I'm developing and training your staff to maintain the systems after I leave. That's what warrants the compensation you've offered. The investors, recognizing that Sarah's presence was generating exactly the kind of serious analytical attention their operation required, agreed to grant her operational authority. Over the following 4 months, Sarah restructured the Colorado breeding program, implemented new record-keeping systems, reorganized management hierarchies, and trained key personnel to maintain her systems after her departure. The results were measurable and significant. Cattle productivity improved. The breeding program became systematic and predictable. Personnel conflicts were largely resolved through clear authority structures and defined responsibilities. By the time Sarah's 6-month engagement concluded, the Colorado operation had transformed from a promising but chaotic venture into a well-organized and productive enterprise. Her compensation, $15,000, was distributed partly into her personal account and partly into the formal Stoneridge Business Partnership account. The money represented genuine capital accumulation that belonged entirely to her, independent of Silas's wealth or control. When Sarah returned to Stoneridge in the autumn of 1910, she found that the household had functioned well during her absence. Eleanor had managed operations with competence. Silas had provided paternal presence. The children, while pleased to see their mother, had not been harmed by her temporary absence. The experience suggested something important, that Sarah's value to her family extended beyond her constant availability. More significantly, her Colorado success had expanded her reputation even further. Agricultural journals requested additional articles, ranchers sought her consultation, universities began requesting guest lectures on breeding practices and ranch management. By 1911, Sarah had become someone recognized not just in regional ranching circles, but increasingly across the broader American agricultural industry. Silas observed these developments with the satisfaction of a man who'd made an investment that had exceeded expectations in ways he couldn't have initially anticipated. "You're becoming quite famous," he observed one evening as Sarah reviewed correspondence from various individuals requesting her expertise. "Is that problematic?" Sarah asked, wondering whether his observation contained criticism rather than simple observation. "Not to me," Silas replied. "I'm watching my wife become recognized for her capability. That reflects well on both of us. The only concern is practical, managing your time and commitments so that you're not overextended in ways that become unsustainable." "I'm careful about what I commit to," Sarah replied. "I turn down far more opportunities than I accept. You should also ensure you're building something permanent," Silas said. "Not just individual consultations or articles, but something that transcends your own expertise. Something that could continue beyond you." "What do you mean?" Sarah asked. "I mean you should consider founding an institution," Silas explained. "An academy or school focused on teaching ranching methodology and breed management to the next generation. Your knowledge is valuable, but if you're the only person who possesses it, it dies when you do. You should ensure it's transmitted to others who can carry it forward." It was a suggestion that Sarah found herself contemplating seriously. Silas was right that her current work, while valuable and recognized, was fundamentally ephemeral individual articles and consultations that didn't create lasting institutional change. But building an academy, establishing a school, creating something that would outlive her, that represented legacy in a way that seemed increasingly important. By the winter of 1911, Sarah had begun preliminary discussions with educational institutions in Texas about the possibility of establishing a program focused on scientific ranching methodology. She consulted with David Chen about financial structures that might support such a school. She discussed with Eleanor the practical question of how such a project might be managed alongside her continuing responsibilities. Silas, observing all of this, found himself reflecting on what their marriage had become. It had begun as a transaction, $3 for a barren woman who might or might not be able to produce children. It had evolved through pregnancy and childbirth, through the physical and emotional demands of motherhood, through Sarah's gradual assumption of authority and responsibility beyond reproductive function. Now, at 65 years old, Silas was approaching the later chapters of his life. Sarah, at 40, was entering the years where her influence and authority could truly expand beyond the constraints that motherhood and household management had imposed. She was becoming something extraordinary, a woman recognized for her expertise, financially independent through her own capital accumulation, and increasingly engaged in work that transcended family and household. One evening, sitting together in the library, Silas made a statement that seemed to encompass the full arc of their journey together. "I bought you for $3 because I needed heirs," he said. "I obtained far more than I sought. You've given me 9 children, yes, but you've also given me partnership, intellectual companionship, and the satisfaction of watching someone I care about exceed every limitation society attempted to place on her. I don't know if I understood at the time what I was investing in, but I'm grateful I had the wisdom to recognize the investment's value. When it became apparent, Sarah, who'd been reviewing correspondence about a potential ranching academy in Austin, set down her letters and considered her husband. Silas Thorne, whom she'd married as a desperate woman accepting the only option available to her, had become something far more important to her than she'd anticipated at the beginning. "You did something unusual," she replied. "You purchased me as a solution to your problem, but you were willing to evolve beyond that initial framework when it became clear I had value beyond that specific purpose. Most men wouldn't have made that evolution. You did." "I had good reason to," Silas replied. "You forced me to. Your capability, your willingness to assert boundaries, your refusal to accept the limitations I initially tried to place on you. These forced me to expand my understanding of what was possible in a marriage, in a partnership, in a life shared with another person." "So the $3 investment," Sarah observed, "turned out to be about far more than the $3. "Immeasurably more," Silas confirmed. "That $3 investment changed my life. I, who suspect it will be changing lives for years to come, through the children we've created together and through whatever institution you establish around your expertise." As Sarah lay in bed that night, thinking about the ranching academy and what it might become, she found herself reflecting on the extraordinary distance she'd traveled. From a desperate woman standing on an auction platform, declared barren and deemed unlikely to find any other option, to a woman whose expertise was sought across multiple states and whose thoughts about farming and breeding were recognized as authoritative. The path had been difficult. Bearing 9 children in 10 years had taken a physical toll she would carry for the rest of her life. But it had also been remarkable in ways she couldn't have anticipated. And the journey was not finished. It was only entering a new phase, one where she could build not just for her own family, but for the broader agricultural community and future generations of ranchers, seeking to understand the science behind their work. The $3 transaction had set all of this in motion. That small transaction had contained within it the possibility of everything that had followed. And as Sarah drifted toward sleep, she found herself grateful not just for the opportunity, But for the man who'd made the investment and had been willing to evolve alongside her as she became something neither of them could have anticipated at the beginning. In the winter of 1913, Silas Thorne experienced a significant health crisis. A severe respiratory infection developed into pneumonia, and for several weeks it remained genuinely unclear whether he would survive. Sarah maintained his care with the same competence and devotion she'd brought to every other challenge in their marriage. She sat with him through fevers and labored breathing. She ensured he received the best medical attention available, and she organized the household and business operations in ways that allowed her to remain present with him while managing the responsibilities that couldn't be delegated. Silas recovered from the pneumonia, but the illness had diminished him noticeably. His energy, never completely restored after recovery, declined further. His physical capacity, which had been gradually diminishing over the previous years, took a marked step backward. He recognized, with the pragmatic acceptance that characterized his approach to most realities, that he was entering the final phase of his life. Rather than withdrawing into decline, Silas made a deliberate decision to ensure the transition of his empire to the next generation, while he remained capable of directing that transition. He began spending considerable time with William, his oldest son, now 25 years old, discussing the cattle operations and grooming him to assume increasing responsibility. He consulted with Sarah about the horse breeding program, ensuring that the system she developed would continue in the hands of Frederick and other managers, even after both Silas and Sarah eventually stepped back. But most significantly, Silas threw his full support behind Sarah's plan to establish the Stonebridge Academy of Ranching Science. He provided capital from the Stonebridge operations to fund the initial construction. He used his political influence with state education officials to secure accreditation, and he made it clear to everyone associated with the business that Sarah's academy was not a secondary project, but something to which they should contribute resources and expertise. "Your mother's knowledge is too valuable to keep contained within a single ranch," Silas told his older children one evening. "She's going to establish a school where the next generation of ranchers can learn the systematic approach to breeding, management, and operations that she's developed. Your role is to support that effort. It's going to be her legacy, and it's going to extend her influence far beyond what any of us could accomplish on our own." By the spring of 1914, construction on the Stonebridge Academy of Ranching Science had begun on land adjacent to the main ranch operations. The facility was designed to accommodate approximately 50 students at a time, with classroom spaces, practical training areas, and housing for students from distant locations. The curriculum was developed by Sarah in consultation with various agricultural experts and university educators. The core focus was systematic ranching, applying scientific principles to breeding, land management, animal health, and financial operations. Sarah began recruiting the first cohort of students through her established agricultural network. She sought young people, both male and female, who demonstrated genuine interest in ranching as a profession and who showed capability for the kind of systematic thinking that the academy emphasized. The first class of 35 students arrived in the autumn of 1914, and the Stonebridge Academy officially began operations. The academy's impact was immediate and substantial. Students received practical training in modern breeding techniques, record-keeping systems, financial management, and personnel development. They spent mornings in classroom study of animal genetics, ranch economics, and operational methodology. They spent afternoons applying those principles on the ranch property, working directly with the cattle and horses, implementing the systems under Sarah's direct observation and guidance. By the end of the first year, the academy's reputation was spreading through ranching communities across the West. Applications for the second cohort dramatically exceeded available space. Ranchers were requesting that their sons, and increasingly their daughters, be accepted into the program. The academy had filled a genuine need in the agricultural industry. a need that Sarah's expertise had identified and that Silas's resources had enabled her to address. In the winter of 1914, as the first cohort of students was completing their initial training, Silas experienced another health crisis, more severe than the respiratory infection. A combination of heart problems and declining overall physical capacity created a situation that Dr. Elliot, who'd remained Sarah's preferred physician throughout the decades of their relationship, assessed with frank honesty. "His body is failing, Doctor," Elliot told Sarah during a private conversation. "Not from any single cause, but from the general deterioration that comes with aging and the specific stresses his body has endured. He may have months, possibly a year or more, if his heart holds stable. But the trajectory is clear. He's entering his final phase of life." Sarah received this news with the quiet acceptance of someone who'd spent enough years observing reality to understand that some things could not be prevented or negotiated around. Silas was 70 years old. He'd lived an extraordinarily full life, built an empire, married a woman he'd initially purchased as a commodity, and had transformed that transaction into genuine partnership. He'd fathered 9 children and was entering the final years where he could mentor them toward their own futures. Over the following months, as Silas's health continued its gradual decline, Sarah found herself reflecting on the decades they'd spent together. She'd been sold to him for $3 by an auctioneer in a warehouse basement, declared barren and deemed unlikely to fulfill even the basic function she was being purchased to provide. And now, 30 years later, she was a woman of substantial influence, recognized across multiple states for her expertise, the founder of an educational institution, a mother of 9, and the partner of a man who'd been willing to evolve beyond his initial assumptions about what she could become. Silas, observing Sarah's management of the academy, her continuing involvement with the ranch operations, her careful tending of his care as his health declined, found himself at peace in a way that surprised him. He'd built a cattle empire and made considerable fortune through shrewd business decisions. He'd acquired political influence and territorial standing. But none of those accomplishments seemed as significant now as the fact that he'd married a woman who'd refused to accept the limitations others tried to impose on her, and had been wise enough to adjust his own understanding as she demonstrated capacities he hadn't initially recognized. In the spring of 1915, Silas made his final formal contribution to the ranching community. He commissioned a significant donation to the Stone Ridge Academy, establishing an endowment that would ensure the institution's financial stability for decades. The donation was made in both his name and Sarah's, but the documentation made clear that Sarah was the intellectual founder and continuing director of the academy. "This is your legacy," Silas told Sarah when he showed her the documents establishing the endowment. "The academy will continue after both of us are gone. Your knowledge, your systematic approach to ranching, your refusal to accept that women couldn't engage in serious agricultural work, all of that will influence generations of ranchers who'll never even know your name personally. That's what legacy is." By the summer of 1915, Silas's health had declined to the point where he spent most of his time in a study chair, looking out at the ranch property he'd spent his life building. Sarah spent increasing amounts of time with him, not out of obligation, but out of genuine desire to be present with this man, who'd transformed her life in ways she could never fully repay. "Do you regret it?" Silas asked her one afternoon as they sat together watching the sun descend toward the horizon. The $3 transaction, the rapid pregnancies, the physical toll of bearing 9 children. Sarah considered the question carefully. "I regret the physical suffering," she replied honestly. "The exhaustion, the difficulty of some of the pregnancies and deliveries, those were genuinely difficult, and I wouldn't wish them on anyone. But do I regret the life they created? No. The children I've borne are remarkable people. The partnership we've built has been genuine and valuable. The work I'm doing with the Academy wouldn't be possible without the foundation everything else has created. So no, I don't regret the transaction. I regret the suffering that was part of it, but not the fundamental choice to marry you and build a life together. I was a different man when I purchased you, Silas said. I was calculating and pragmatic in ways that didn't leave much room for genuine connection. You forced me to evolve. You demanded partnership rather than subordination. And in doing so, you made my life infinitely richer than it would have been if I'd simply acquired a compliant woman who accepted her role without question. We transformed each other, Sarah replied. I came to you broken by circumstance, convinced my body was incapable of the one thing society said defined my value as a woman. You came to me seeking a solution to a practical problem. Instead of either of us remaining in those initial positions, we both evolved. That evolution is what made everything else possible. Silas Thorne passed away peacefully in his sleep in October of 1915 at the age of 71. He'd lived long enough to see the first cohort of Academy students graduate and disperse into ranching operations across the West. He'd lived long enough to ensure that his 9 children understood the legacy he was leaving, not just the cattle empire, but the example of partnership and mutual evolution that he and Sarah had demonstrated. The funeral was attended by hundreds. Ranchers from across Texas and neighboring territories came to pay respects. State political figures attended. Members of the academic and agricultural community who'd been influenced by his various enterprises came to acknowledge his passing. But the most significant conversations at the funeral weren't about Silas's business accomplishments. They were about Sarah. That woman transformed him, one prominent rancher remarked to another, and he transformed her. They should have destroyed each other, a desperate woman purchased at an auction and a pragmatic rancher seeking efficiency. Instead, they created something remarkable. The Academy will be her real legacy, the other rancher replied. Silas built an empire of cattle. She's building an institution that will influence how ranching is done for generations. That's a different kind of power. In the years following Silas's death, Sarah threw herself into the work of building the Academy into an institution of genuine substance. She expanded the curriculum, brought in additional instructors with expertise in specific areas, and established partnerships with universities to ensure the Academy maintained academic rigor. She continued to publish articles on ranching methodology, drawing increasingly on observations from the students and their questions about how to apply systematic principles to various operational challenges. By 1920, the Stone Ridge Academy had become recognized as one of the premier agricultural educational institutions in the American West. Ranchers actively sought positions for their children in the Academy's competitive selection process. The graduates of the Academy were recognized throughout the industry as individuals who understood both the science and the practical reality of ranching operations. More significantly, the Academy had become a symbol of something broader, the reality that women could engage in serious intellectual work in agricultural fields. Sarah had broken through barriers that had seemed insurmountable by demonstrating that expertise and capability transcended gender. The women who came to the Academy as students, who worked with Sarah and Frederick and the other instructors, understood that their gender was not a limitation on what they could accomplish. Sarah's 9 children, meanwhile, had all moved into adulthood and were building their own lives and careers. William was managing the cattle operations with increasing sophistication. James had taken over the horse breeding program from Frederick, applying both his mother's original vision and his own innovations to the work. Robert had become involved in territorial governance and land development. Elizabeth was running a profitable agricultural supply business in San Antonio. Thomas was developing innovative water management systems for ranches across Texas. Catherine, the oldest daughter, had rejected marriage entirely and instead had become Sarah's primary assistant in running the Academy, eventually assuming significant responsibility for curriculum development and student mentorship. Virginia and Samuel, the twins, had both pursued education and were involved in agricultural research at universities. And Margaret, the youngest, had married a progressive rancher who supported her continued engagement with the Academy's work and the broader agricultural community. As Sarah entered her 60s, she found herself recognized as one of the most influential voices in American ranching. She'd published 3 books on systematic ranching methodology. She'd been invited to speak at agricultural conferences across the country. She'd corresponded with leading agricultural researchers at universities, providing practical insights that informed their theoretical work. But perhaps most importantly, she'd become a symbol for what was possible when someone refused to accept the limitations that society attempted to place on them. The woman purchased for $3 at an auction, declared barren and deemed unlikely to be useful for any purpose, had become an educator, a businesswoman, a mother of 9, a partner in building an empire, and the founder of an institution that would influence agricultural practices for generations. In 1925, at the age of 53, Sarah established a scholarship fund at the Stone Ridge Academy in honor of Silas Thorne, designating the funds specifically to support students who demonstrated genuine capability but lacked financial resources to attend. The scholarship honored the man who'd had the wisdom to recognize potential in a desperate woman and who'd been willing to evolve beyond his initial assumptions about what that woman could become. As Sarah sat in the library of the main house at Stone Ridge, reviewing applications from Academy students, seeking her guidance on various questions, she found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought her to this point. From auction platform to educational institution founder, from declared barren to mother of 9, from desperate commodity to influential voice in her industry, the transaction had contained within it the possibility of everything that had followed. That small amount of money had been the entry point to a life she could never have imagined when she was standing on that platform, uncertain whether any man would bid at all for a woman declared incapable of bearing children. She thought often of Silas during these years after his death. She'd loved him, she realized, though it wasn't a love based on romance or initial attraction. It was a love built through genuine partnership, through shared accomplishment, through mutual respect, earned across decades of choosing, repeatedly, to work together rather than against each other. The Stone Ridge Academy continued to grow, to influence, to prepare the next generation of ranchers to approach their work with scientific understanding and systematic methodology. And at the center of that institution was Sarah Winters Thorne, a woman who'd refused to accept that she was broken, who'd insisted on partnership instead of subordination, and who'd used whatever influence she'd acquired to demonstrate to other women that alternatives to conventional compliance existed. The $3 investment had paid dividends beyond anything Silas could have anticipated. And Sarah had invested those dividends, not in accumulating personal wealth, but in building something that would endure long after both she and Silas were gone, an institution dedicated to teaching others the systematic approach to ranching that she'd developed through decades of observation, experimentation, and genuine engagement with the work. That was her legacy. Not the 9 children, though they were remarkable. Not the articles and publications, though they'd influenced the industry, but an institution, a place where people could come to learn that capability transcends gender, that systematic thinking improves outcomes, and that refusing to accept society's limitations on your potential is not just possible, but transformative. And it had all begun with $3, a desperate woman, and a man willing to evolve beyond his initial assumptions about what she could become. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.